The last time we were together, we looked at how and why the children of Israel became slaves in Egypt. And we noted that God is truly able to use the sinful propensity of mankind to see his agenda worked out. Now, God told Abraham that his descendants would be forced into slavery, but that he would bring them out in a way that would show the world the glory and the power of Abraham's God. So, throughout this series that we've been looking at the history of the Bible, we've dealt with the truth that for whatever reason, God has chosen to work out his plan through people. And that time and time again, we see God raising up a leader who would allow him to allow God to work through him to accomplish God's purposes. That seems to be the MO that God has used. We've seen it so far, and I will actually argue, spoiler alert, we will see this throughout the rest of the story of the Bible as well. So today I'd like to look with you at who I believe is the most important man in the history of the nation of Israel. Because you see, if it wasn't for Moses, there would be no Jewish nation as we know it, no Jewish nation in antiquity as we know it. And so I like to look at the account of the calling of Moses. And so next on Digging Deeper, I'd like us to look at what was it that made Moses so great. Moses was the pivotal figure in the forming of the nation of Israel. Without him, like I say, you've got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That they got the people together, but you don't have the nation without Moses. And so I'd like to take a look with you at Moses' young life, as his early life, his early days, and what were the events that happened that prepared him for the mission that God was going to give him to ultimately found and to institute the nation that we know of as Israel. And so I want to take a look first of all at just the narrative, and then I'd like to look with you at three principles. Um, Three principles from the life of Moses that I believe are timeless and are true for us today. So in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, it gives us the account of Moses' birth and his formative years, his early formative years. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 2, and we'll read through verse 10, it says, "And now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. And now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and while her young women walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. And so she took pity on him, and she said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." And then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And so the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." And so the woman took the child and nursed him. And when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Now, last week, the last time we were together, we looked at the beginning of the 18th dynasty of Egypt and how Ahmose the first led an army up against the foreign invaders, the Hyksos, and defeated them in battle and kicked them out of Egypt. Now we know that the Hyksos were they were stationed, if you will. They lived in the northern part of Egypt, up along the Nile Delta region, and they had as their capital Avaris. And they chose Avaris as their capital because there was already a Semitic presence in that part of Egypt. And again, this is we know from history that Avaris was populated by a Semitic group of people when the Hyksos came in. Now there's no record whatsoever that the inhabitants of Avaris that they joined in the conquest of Egypt. They were very content to just be left alone. And but they still the Hyksos stayed with them because they felt comfortable. They were among siblings, if you will, or at least distant relatives. And so and that people group flourished. And now it took the rest of and after Moses kicked them out, it took the rest of his reign to consolidate his power. And the third Pharaoh in the 18th dynasty is a man by the name of Thutmose I. And I believe that he was probably the Pharaoh who was so concerned with the Semitic people living in Avaris that he forced them into slavery and ultimately tried to wipe them out by killing all of their young sons. And his daughter, by his favorite wife, was a lady by the name of Hatshepsut. We'll talk about her more in just a minute. And I believe that she was most probably the woman who found the baby boy in the boat of reeds in the river and called him Moses. Now, it tells us here that Moses' sister watched her brother be fished out of the river, and she just happened to be there. And when Pharaoh's daughter realized that this was a Hebrew child, she just happened to have a spare Hebrew wet nurse that would be more than happy to nurse this child for Hatshepsut. I mean, what a credible group of coincidences that were taking place. And Hatshepsut, or whoever this Pharaoh's daughter, said that was a good idea, and so she paid Moses' mother to nurse Moses and raise him. And then he, understanding that she would eventually bring him to the court of Egypt where he would take his rightful place. Now, this passage tells us two things. Two things that I think are very important in the development of Moses as a leader, as a man who was called to a specific time period. And the first thing is this, is that Moses spent his young life, his youngest life, his formative years with his mother and with his mother's people. So he was able to understand a little bit more about what it meant to be Hebrew and what it meant to be a follower of the God of the Hebrews. And then the second thing that this tells us is that Moses spent his adolescent and his early adult years in the court of Egypt. And so Moses learned about what it meant to be a part of a people of God from his mother, and he also learned what it was like to be a part of the royal court from his stepmother, who was Pharaoh's daughter. And so Moses, understanding these two cultures, was going to make him very effective in the mission that God is going to give him later. And so things are going pretty well here. He goes into Pharaoh's court, and you would think that life would be going well. But the very next thing that we see here in verse 11 of chapter 2 is we see some intrigue. And now all of a sudden the plot shifts a little bit. It says, one day when Moses had grown up and he went out to his people and he looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and one of his own people. And so he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man who was in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? And he answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Now hear this. And then Moses was afraid and thought, surely this thing is known. And when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. Now, this paragraph is fascinating to me because on the face of things, Doesn't make any sense. You see, Moses was a prince in Egypt. He was of the royal family. He was different from everybody else. And so for Moses to kill an Egyptian really was no big deal. Moses could kill any Egyptian he wanted. But there was something in this and something in this account that made Pharaoh want to kill him. And the question we have to ask ourselves is why? Why would Pharaoh care about some dead Egyptian who was killed at the hand of a prince in Egypt? Well, this is where we need to build an historical bridge. See, if we combine Hebrews 11 with Exodus 1, it's reasonable for us to conclude that Pharaoh's daughter was a young lady by the name of Hatshepsut. Now, Hatshepsut's father was Thutmose I, who would have been, like I say, I think the Pharaoh who had the issue with the Hebrews. And she was married to his son, Thutmose II. And when Thutmose II died, she ruled Egypt as a co-regent with her stepson, Thutmose III. So here we have Thutmose I, his son and his daughter get married, and his son Thutmose II has a child through one of his other wives. And so when he died, Thutmose III was very young. And so Hatshepsut served as a regent, if you will, as somebody who was reigning while Thutmose III was growing up. And so Thutmose III absolutely detested his stepmother. Now, we know that he was a very capable leader. In fact, history tells us that he led no less than 18 campaigns where he actually strengthened Egypt, and their borders grew, and he did a lot to strengthen the sovereignty of Egypt. And they were, everywhere he went, Egypt got bigger and stronger. But Hatshepsut, who was his stepmother, was loved. And she was an incredibly capable leader. And so, again, when she died, Thutmose wanted to get rid of that, even though he was very capable in his own self. But that here we may explain why Moses had to flee. It's the only thing that makes sense to me, because actually he could do whatever he wanted. But there was something about this that made his situation a little bit precarious in the court of Egypt. And this is the only thing that actually makes sense to me. And so Moses had to flee because of the intrigue. He could use this as an excuse to get rid of Moses. And so Moses was a reminder to Pharaoh, Thutmose III, that he was not the most popular ruler in the land. And so Moses may have been seen as a rival. And Hebrews chapter 11 seems to support this idea, that it says that Moses gave up the throne of Egypt to identify with God and God's people. So again, Thutmose III was a very capable leader in his own right. He was a fantastic general. He widened the scope of Egyptian sovereignty. And he didn't have Moses. Moses was gone. He had no rival. Now, Thutmose III died, and while Moses was in exile, and his second son, by the name of Amenhotep II, takes over as king. Now, we know that Moses had to flee Egypt because he was a legitimate threat to Thutmose III. Now, we have noted over and over again that the guy who had the most difficult time getting any kind of life insurance was the one who was the threat to the throne. And so Moses had to flee because he had no choice. And so he took off to a place where Pharaoh couldn't touch him. So let's continue reading in Exodus chapter 2, verses 15 to 22. It says, "But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. And now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and they drew water, and they filled the troughs of water to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. And when they came home to their father, Reuel, he said, how is it that you have come home so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock. So he said to his daughters, oh, then where is this guy? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread with us. And then Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah, and she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom. For he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. So the important thing for us is this, is that God parked Moses in the perfect place when he was on sabbatical, when he was in exile. That he first of all, he was far enough away from Egyptian control. It's the first thing. But not only that, but he was befriended by a distant relative who just happened to be a follower of Yahweh. In fact, he was a priest of Yahweh. And we know that the Midianites were descendants of Abraham through his second wife, Keturah. And so in Midian, he was influenced by his father-in-law in what a relationship with Yahweh looked like. Because right now, remember, he spent his adolescence, his young adult years in the court of Egypt. So he learned how the Egyptians did things. He learned the Egyptian pantheon. So now he's learning what it means to be a follower of Yahweh and to be a monotheist. This is a big bit of his education. So now God has his deliverer, even though the deliverer didn't know that he was the deliverer. And so, of course, the question is God ready to act now? Is now the time that God is going to act? And so in Exodus chapter 2, beginning of verse 23, it says, and during those many days the king of Egypt died. And the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. And their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel. And it says that God knew. Now, we'll talk about how God calls Moses the next time that we're together. But this week, right now, I'd like to point out three principles. Three principles that come from the early life of Moses that I believe are important to us today. And the first thing that I think that we need to understand is that God will always train the person that he wants to lead and go into a mission. But God's never going to send anybody to a mission that he hasn't trained him for. Now, you say, but you didn't go to seminary, you didn't go to Bible college. No, because, see, life was the curriculum. If you think about it, most of the events that happened in Moses' life led him and gave him the experience and the knowledge that he was going to need to fulfill the task that God gave him. From saving his life by being put in the Ark of Reeds, to being found by Pharaoh's daughter, who then became the most competent ruler in the early 18th dynasty, to his education in the court of Pharaoh, and then his reconnecting with his birth people. All of these events impacted Moses' life and made him the man that he was. And so God's going to train people to do what he wants them to do. And life is the curriculum that he's going to use. And then the second principle I want us to grab a hold of is that we may not know that we're being prepared. Because life is the curriculum, that God will bring us where he wants us to go. And he's not always obligated to tell us that he's training us. And so it's very possible that we could be going through some difficult times. And the reason that we're going through those difficult times is so that we would be able to build our faith up and we would be able to gather the skills that we need to do the ministry that God gives us in the future. And we may not always know it. So we have to understand that as we're walking day by day with God, that in the things that we're doing, the studies that we're learning, the things that we're reading from the scriptures, on all of the parts of life that we go through, is something that God uses to train us to get to the point to where we can do the ministry and the mission that God has for us. And then the third principle, and this is one that's very, very important to us, and that is that God is the one who determines who's qualified. And this is going to show up in the life of Moses, because later on we're going to find out that Moses tries to talk God out of the mission that God gave him. And God told him that he was qualified because God called him. And this is a pattern that we're going to see throughout Scripture. God never calls the qualified. What he does is he qualifies the called. And that's a very important issue for us to understand, is that if we are waiting for us to have all of the answers, if we're waiting that we completely know everything that we need to know, that completely misses the point. Because you see, if we can do things on our own, then we ultimately don't need God. And so God is the one who determines who's qualified. And so God was able to take a man who was fairly shy, a man who was a stutterer, and have him go to the most powerful person on the planet, as far in his world anyway, and tell him what he didn't want to hear. And Moses was the one, even though he didn't know it at the time. He didn't know. I mean, he had no control over where he was born, who his parents were. But coming from the Hebrews, that and understanding what it meant to be living in life with the Hebrews. And he did that in all of his young formative years. And then moving into the palace of Egypt, so that he actually was able to go before Pharaoh. I mean, the reason he was able to go before Pharaoh so easily was because he was part of the royal family. And so God used all of these things to qualify him, and to put him in a position where God could use him. And I think that that's something that's incredibly important for us. Because you see, there's good news for us. And that's that I can't find many people in the entire Bible who ever felt that they were qualified to do what God wanted them to do. And that should give us great hope. Because you see, God is calling each and every one of us to do a ministry. The Bible tells us that we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God created in advance that we should do. And we see this principle lived out in the life of Moses, that God is going to call somebody. And so as we're looking through the history of this, we see that in history, God called a man. God qualified him, even though he didn't know that God was in the process of training him. God trained him to do the mission that he wanted him to do. And God was the one who determined whether or not Moses or anybody else is qualified to do the ministry and the mission that he has for us. And so I thank you for making it to the end. And I pray that if these videos bless you, again, hit that subscribe button so that you can get them when they come up. Hit the notification bell so that you'll know when they come on. And feel free to share with your friends. And I pray that as you meet with your siblings in Christ this week in worship, that you have an incredible time, that you really sense God's presence as you gather. And I look forward to seeing you again in a future video. God bless you all.